The lesson is from Habakkuk, chapter 3, verses 17 through 19. Though the fig tree does not blossom and no fruit is on the vines, though the produce of the olive fails and the fields yield no food, though the flock is cut off from the fold and there is no herd in the stalls, nevertheless, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer and makes me tread upon the heights. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
And will you bow with me for prayer? O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the thoughts of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. And let all God's people say, amen. So here's what was going on for the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk. He says, though there are no blossoms on the fig trees, and even though there is no food in the field, he says, even though the sheep have all gotten lost, and even though the cattle have all died, here's what he decides to do. He says, nevertheless, I will rejoice in the Lord. Even though all of that is true, nevertheless, I will exult in the God of my salvation, which just goes to show that gratitude does not come to us from the outside, doesn't come from the things that happen to us. Gratitude comes from the inside. It is an attitude with which we can greet each new day. Gratitude is a faith commitment we make based on faith that even though all sorts of bad things will happen, nevertheless, we will give thanks to God. Now, in a minute, I want to share several different ways of thinking about a theology of gratitude. But first, I want to tell you a story. I don't think that I've told you this story yet at this church. I've told it many times in many other places, and I probably will tell it to you again, probably next Thanksgiving and the Thanksgiving after that. It really made an impact on me, and I tell it because I hope it will make an impact on you. When I was in graduate school at the University of Illinois, I went to church at the Wesley Foundation right there on campus, and I had a friend at church named Chris. Chris was a lot of fun to be around. He was the sort of person I just admired his spirit, his integrity. There was one thing that Chris did that kind of irritated me a little bit. At that worship service, student worship service on Wednesday night, all of us at the end of the service would make a big circle, we'd join hands, and we'd pray around that circle. You know how it goes. When it comes to you can pray out loud if you want, or you can pass it to the next person. And whenever we would do that, Chris always had something to say out loud. And every single time, he always started his prayer exactly the same way. He would always say, Lord, I just want to thank you for this day. I'm not sure why that irritated me. It's just that after 3 or 4 months of hearing him say exactly the same thing, when it got to be Chris's turn, I would sort of secretly think to myself, Lord, I just hope he says something different for a change. It seemed rote, repetitious. I thought maybe Chris wasn't really thinking about what he was saying to God. Well, one night before worship, I was talking with Chris, and he told me, tears in his eyes, he told me he had just had an awful day, maybe one of the worst days of his entire life. He said that at noon, his mom had called him to tell him that a dear relative had been diagnosed with cancer and that it was life-threatening. And he said, before we even got out the door on our way to school this morning, he says, my wife and I had this big fight, and we haven't had any time to talk it through yet. And then he said, and in the afternoon, a fire broke out in the lab where I work, and it destroyed several weeks' worth of my research project. He said, I'm not even sure what that's going to do to my academic progress. What a day he had had. And I was sympathetic to to Chris, I also thought to myself, well, tonight's the night that he's going to pray a different prayer. Surely he's not going to thank God for this horrible day. So after worship, the prayer was going around the circle. The person next to Chris finished, and there was kind of a long pause. And then Chris started to pray. And here's what he said. He said, Lord, I just want to thank you for this day. I couldn't believe it. I cornered Chris after worship, and I demanded to know, Chris, do you even think about what you say to God, or are you just spouting stuff off? How could you thank God for this day of all days? And Chris looked at me a little surprised, and he said, Glenn, I think you know, I've had a hard life, a rough childhood. And he said, you know, a long time ago, I just decided that I am going to thank God for every day God gives me. And that way, I don't have to try to decide, does God deserve to be thanked today or not deserve to be thanked today? I just always thank Him. You see, my friend Chris, like the prophet Habakkuk, understood that gratitude doesn't come from the outside, from the things that happen to us. Gratitude comes from the inside. It's an attitude with which we can greet every day. It's a faith commitment that we make based on our relationship with God, that even in the worst of days, we can decide to pray this prayer, Lord, I just want to thank you for this day. Now, there are different ways of thinking about it, of conceiving a theology of gratitude. I'm going to share 2 or 3 with you. Maybe one of them will resonate with you. Here is one. The Buddhist teacher Jack Kornfield says that whatever we practice, we become. Whatever we practice, we become. In other words, whatever you let yourself do over and over, whatever you allow yourself to focus on, that's who you will be. Remember a couple weeks ago I was teaching about spiritual practices, right? From the book by Diana Butler Bass. Spiritual practices are not simply things that you do over and over. A spiritual practice is something you do that has the power to change who you are. It has the power to help you to see and experience the world in a different way. So, if you want to have more joy and praise in your life, what do you need to do? Well, like Habakkuk, you need to focus on joy, right? You need to make a commitment to praise. If you want to be more grateful and thankful, what do you need to do? Well, like Habakkuk, you need to focus on gratitude. You need to make a commitment to give thanks. I mean, there's always going to be even those out there, right? Even though this didn't go right, even though that part of life is falling apart. I mean, maybe your life isn't as drastic as Habakkuk seemed to be. Maybe it is. But there's always something, right? There's always something. And so if your life has some even those in it, you need this word in your vocabulary. Nevertheless. You need to know that word, nevertheless. Here's how it works. Even though some of my friends have let me down, nevertheless, I will thank God that God is always with me. Or even though my health isn't good and I'm sick right now, nevertheless, I will give thanks to God for doctors and caregivers. Even though I'm dying, nevertheless, I will give thanks to God that I ever had the gift of life. You see, whatever we practice, whatever we say and do over and over, that's who we're going to be, right? It might as well be gratitude, right? So that's one. Here's another. One of my favorite preachers, Fleming Rutledge, became the long-term caregiver for an elderly widow. She was the wife of a work colleague. He died and didn't have any family to care for his wife. And so Fleming Rutledge says, well, you know, I knew I had to do it. He'd asked me while he was still alive. I agreed to do it. I knew it was something I had to do. But she says, secretly, I really didn't want to do that. And she says, I was really busy in my life at that time. I had lots of other things to do. It took a lot of time. She says, honestly, I didn't even know the woman very well. But she says, I did it. For the rest of her years, I visited her and I managed her affairs. And she says, much to my surprise, it became a pleasure. It became even a great joy. And here's why. She says, it's because of that woman's incredible gratitude. Rather than complaining that I didn't visit often enough, she would thank me profusely that I visited at all. If I would do some tiny little favor for her, she would thank me as though I had given her a lavish gift. It was just always like that. And here's the point that Rutledge is making. She says this woman's thankfulness actually created a new world. It created a new reality in my life. That she says that gratitude is soul expanding. Gratitude is contagious. It spreads to the people around us, even the grouchy people around us. It spreads to, think about it. Who would you rather spend time with? Somebody who's complaining all the time that there's no food in the field and the sheep have all gotten out? Or somebody who's exulting in the God of their salvation? Me too, that's who we want to spend time with. We got to remember that gratitude doesn't come from the outside, from the things that happen to us. Gratitude comes from the inside. It's a commitment that we make based on our relationship with God. And gratitude can create a whole new reality, even in the hardest of times. All right? That's another one. Here's one more. In Philippians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul gives his take on gratitude. And apparently, the Philippians had been kind of major financial supporters of Paul's ministry earlier. And then it went a long time, and he didn't get a check in the mail from the Philippians, And when he finally did get a contribution from them, here's how he responded. I'm just going to read to you what Paul writes in Philippians 4. He says, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I am not saying this because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. He says, I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Here's what Paul is saying, I think. It's easier to be grateful to people if you don't put a lot of expectations on them, right? And that way, if they give a lot, you're grateful. And if they only give a little, you're grateful. If they don't give anything at all, you're grateful. Because, see, gratitude doesn't come from the outside, what we get and what we have. Gratitude comes from the inside. It's an attitude with which we greet anything that we have. It's a faith commitment based on a relationship with God. All right? Now, I want to be careful not to push this theology of gratitude too far. Anything that you push too far kind of becomes untrue. I'm not saying that you can only ever be happy, right? That gratitude is the only emotion you can ever express. We all get scared or unhappy or upset sometimes, and it's okay to express those things in the right way. If you have those negative emotions and you try to deny them or tamp them down, they will come out, right? Maybe you'll get sick. Maybe when you do express gratitude, it will come across as passive-aggressive. Maybe you'll explode at somebody around you for no reason. So it's healthy. It's okay to feel and express a whole range of feelings. What I'm saying is that when there are no blossoms on the fig tree and there's no food in the field, and when the sheep are all lost and the cattle have all died, along with a little fretting, let's also give thanks to God, shall we? Along with maybe a little complaining and fear, let's also exult in the God of our salvation. Because gratitude doesn't come from what happens to us, from what we get. Gratitude comes from the inside. It is the attitude with which we receive whatever we get. You know, there's really only one alternative to gratitude, right? It's bitterness and complaining. And I personally, I know what bitterness and complaining can do to some of the people around me, how it makes them come across, and I expect that some of the people around me know what bitterness and complaining do to me and how they make me come across. And so, with a nod to my old friend Chris, and by the grace of God and to the best of my ability, I have decided that whatever happens in any given day, I'm going to pray this prayer. Lord, I just want to thank you for this day. When I was a kid back home in Kansas, there was a man in my little hometown, and he and his brother inherited all of their father's substantial farmland. He just split it down the middle. They got equal portions on either side of a little country road. You probably wouldn't have been able to tell one farm from the other, except they struck oil on his brother's land. And he got a lot of money. He was pretty generous with the money, but it was his money, you know. And even though they drilled countless wells on his own land, they all came up dry. And for the rest of this man's life, he was always saying versions of this. He would say, well, if they'd struck oil on my land instead of my brother's, I could do more for my church. And he would say, if they'd struck oil on my land instead of my brother's, I'd be able to take people on big trips to Hawaii. And if they'd struck oil on my land, my kids would have been able to go to private school too. He was delightful, you know. And one time he'd just gone on one of those tirades and he'd left the room, and I remember a man saying about him, he says, you know, he's only got one card to play and he just keeps playing it everywhere he goes. And I got to thinking about that the other day. What if all of us only had one card to play and we just kept playing it everywhere we went? But what if instead of the card of bitterness and complaining, what if that card was gratitude? What if we played thanksgiving everywhere we went? You know, mealtime is a good time to play the Thanksgiving card, isn't it? Mealtime. It used to be in our household, we were a table for 4. And it was wonderful. There were tears and giggles and spilled milk and stories around the table. And every time we would sit down to eat together, we would all join hands in a circle around the table and we would give thanks to God. And then there came a time when we were a table for 3. And one daughter was far away at college. But we would still join hands, a diminished circle, but we would still join hands and we would give thanks to God. And now, of course, Carolyn and I make a table for 2. And there's not many tears and there's not many giggles and there's not as many stories. But every time Carolyn and I sit down to eat together, we reach across that table and we join each other's hands and we give thanks to God. That's what you do. Mealtime is a wonderful time to play that Thanksgiving card. I remember years ago visiting in the hospital a woman named Sue. She had had a mild heart attack, and it was just taking her a long time to recover. And during that visit, she got to reflecting back on her life and telling me about some of the things that she had been through. She'd had her appendix burst just a couple of years before, and she spent weeks in the ICU, and she was stuck at home and couldn't get out for several months. She told me that at that time, she had been a widow longer than I had been alive. She had lost not one, but two of her children to death, one to a tragic accident and one to cancer, and that wasn't really all there was. And after a while, she kind of fell silent, and we just sat there for a time. And then she dabbed her eyes, and the next thing she said to me was this. She said, "But you know, Pastor, I have been blessed. It's been a good life, and I am grateful for all of it." And I picked up that card that she had played, and I slipped it in my pocket. I hope that many of you got to know John and Velda Potts, members of this church. I keep talking about them because they have made a deep influence on my heart and faith. I hope you got to know them. Velda had a stroke, about 3 years or so ago, and John just dedicated the rest of his life to caring for her day in and day out in this kind and caring way. It was beautiful to watch. And then John got diagnosed with cancer, and just a few months later, he was gone. And it just felt so unfair to me. It didn't seem right. But the last time that John talked to me, he called me on the phone just a week before he died, and John didn't have 30 seconds to complain. What he wanted to tell me about was this marvelous experience of prayer that he had had, and he wanted to tell me how wonderful and blessed his life had been. That's all he had time to tell me about. A couple weeks ago, I got to go to Westminster Thurber and have lunch with Velda, and we got to talking a bit. And she was weak and tired. She was tearful and sad. And Velda had not one word to say by way of complaint. Not one. All that she wanted to tell me over and over was how blessed she was to have had 60 years with John. And what I'm wondering this morning is, can I give you that card? Can I give you that card that John and Velda Potts just kept playing over and over everywhere they went throughout their life? I've got one of those cards somewhere, but I'm forever setting it down and losing track. I can't find it. When I most need to play the gratitude card is when it's hardest for me to find it. Some of you know by now that I am by nature a person, I'm prone to some discouragement, a little anxiety. And so when the church budget doesn't balance, and right now it doesn't balance, I get all fretful and worried about it. And when the church isn't growing, and right now the church isn't growing, I blame myself and I feel bad about it. And when there's conflict, I want to run away and hide. And of course, right then is when I need to play that gratitude card, right? Because gratitude doesn't come from the outside, doesn't come from the things that happen to us or to the church. Gratitude comes from the inside. It's an attitude with which we can greet everything that happens. It's a faith commitment we make based on our relationship with God. That even though all sorts of bad things may happen, nevertheless, we will give thanks to God. So, here's what I want you to do today. In your bulletin, you should find one of these cards. They're different colors today. If you don't have one, if it's fallen out along the way, I got a whole stack up here, and just raise your hand in a minute. I'll bring you one, or you can come and get one. And at the top it says, even though, right? And a little bit below that it says, nevertheless. I want you to find a pen or pencil, share with somebody next to you if you need to. And here's what I want you to do. At the top where it says, even though, I want you to write down the hardest thing in your life right now. Whatever's causing you the most stress and heartache, whatever it is that makes it hard for you to feel grateful right now. Just write it. Nobody's going to see it, okay? Just write it at the top of the card, all right? Do that right now. Anybody need a card? All right, when you've got something written there, then drop down to the nevertheless. And that's where you get to write down what you have decided to do. Maybe you have decided to pray, Lord, I just want to give you thanks every day. Maybe you have decided to sing a song of gratitude every day. Maybe you have decided to be kind to the people around you every day. What have you decided to do by way of an attitude of gratitude? All right? Nevertheless, and even though. All right, got something there? All right, here's what we're going to do. Today we're not going to hang that card on the wall. That might be a little too personal. What I want you to do is I want you to take that card with you. Will you slip it in your pocket? Maybe put it in your wallet, slip it down in your purse so that you have it with you. Maybe you'll be somebody someday that somebody will say, you know, he or she, they only had one card to play. And they just kept playing it everywhere they went. And that card was gratitude. Even though all sorts of bad things will happen, nevertheless, we will give thanks to God. And even though it might be the very worst day of your life, here is the prayer you can pray. Will you pray it with me? Lord, I just want to thank you. I don't hear you praying it with me. You know it by now, right? Don't be stubborn. You ready? Lord, I just want to thank you for this day. Amen. And that's how you have gratitude in the hardest of times.